I have a big job this morning. We've been in a sermon series about the patriarchs in the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis has 50 chapters. It's a very large book. And there's a lot of stories in it. The story of Joseph, one of the sons of Jacob, Israel, is a big story. It's an important story. It's a story I don't want to miss. So instead of me going through the whole thing, I have got a video to play of the Bible Project. You probably have looked up the Bible Project. If you haven't looked at the Bible Project, look at the Bible Project. It's kind of neat. Little cartoons go through, like give you the clip notes on the Bible. So without any further ado, Leo, the Bible Project video about Joseph.
Now, it's this last part of the book, the story of Jacob's sons, where all the themes come to a head. Jacob loves his second to youngest son, Joseph, more than any of the others, and he gives him this special jacket. And the 10 older sons come to hate Joseph, and so they kidnap him, and they plan to kill him, but instead they decide to just sell him into slavery in Egypt, where he ends up in prison. Talk about family failure. But God is with Joseph, and he orchestrates Joseph's release from prison, and Pharaoh ends up elevating Joseph to second in command over all of Egypt. And so Joseph saves the nation of Egypt during a famine. And he also ends up saving his brothers and his family from starving to death. And so once again, we can see the folly and the sin of Abraham's family is met with God's faithfulness, who subverts even the evil of the brothers into an occasion to save life. And this is actually what Joseph says right near the end of the book. He says to his brothers, "You all planned this for evil, but God planned it for good, to save many lives." Now, these words are strategically placed at the end of the book because they summarize not only the story of Joseph and his brothers, but the book as a whole.
Okay. That's not the end of the 50 chapters, but it's a good beginning for a conversation about Joseph. So Genesis chapter 37, if you'd like to follow along with me, I'll be reading from chapter 37 and chapter 45, just trying to get all the story of Joseph in one sermon, because I wasn't here last week when the lectionary had the first part. So even though the lectionary condenses this whole story into 2 weeks, which is really not enough time, I'm condensing those 2 weeks into one. So there's a lot. So Genesis chapter 37, verses 18 through 36. They saw Joseph in the distance before he got close to them. And I think you know who them is, right? 10 of his brothers. And they plotted to kill him. The brothers said to each other, "Here comes the big dreamer. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of the cisterns, and we'll say a wild animal devoured him, and then we'll see what becomes of his dreams." When Reuben heard what they said, he saved him from them, telling them, "Let's not take his life." Reuben said to them, "Don't spill his blood. Throw him into this desert cistern, but don't lay a hand on him." He intended to save Joseph from them and take him back to his father. When Joseph reached his brothers, they stripped off Joseph's long robe, took him and threw him into the cistern, an empty cistern with no water in it. When they sat down to eat, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with camels carrying sweet resin, medicinal resin, and fragrant resin on their way to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What do we gain if we kill our brother and hide his blood? Come on, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. Let's not harm him because he's our brother, he's family." His brothers agreed. When some Midianite traders passed by, they pulled Joseph up out of the cistern. They sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph out to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and found that Joseph wasn't in it, he tore his clothes. Then he returned to his brothers and said, "The boy's gone. And where can I go now?" His brothers took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a male goat, and dipped the robe in blood. They took the long robe and brought it to their father and said, "We found this. See if it's your son's robe or not." He recognized it and said, "It's my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him." Joseph must have been torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his clothes and put a simple mourning cloth around his waist and mourned for his son for many days. All of his sons and daughters got up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted, telling them, "I'll go to my grave mourning my son." And Joseph's father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold Joseph to the Egyptians, to Potiphar, Pharaoh's chief officer, command of the royal guard. Now, Genesis 45, 1 through 15. A lot happens in between. Maybe I should go over it a little bit. He becomes, like the video said, Pharaoh's right-hand man, did all these amazing things. Now he's in charge of everything. There's a famine in the land. The brothers are sent by their father to come into Egypt to beg Pharaoh for some food for their community. But it's Joseph they're begging from, and they don't recognize him. So here we find in chapter 45, Joseph could no longer control himself in front of all his attendants. So he declared, "Everyone leave now." So no one stayed with him when he revealed his identity to his brothers. He wept so loudly that the Egyptians and Pharaoh's household heard him. Joseph said to his brothers, "I'm Joseph. Is my father still alive?" His brothers could not respond because they were terrified before him. Well, how would you feel? Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me," and they moved closer. He said, "I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold to Egypt. Now, don't be upset and don't be angry with yourselves that you sold me here. Actually, God sent me before you to save lives. We've already had 2 years of famine in the land, and there are 5 years left without planting or harvesting. God sent me before you to make sure you'd survive and to rescue your lives in this amazing way. You didn't send me here. It was God who made me a father of Pharaoh, master of his entire household, and ruler of the whole land of Egypt. Hurry, go back to your father. Tell him this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me master of all Egypt. Come down to me. Don't delay. You may live in the land of Goshen, so you will be near me, your children, your grandchildren, your flocks, your herds, and everyone with you. I will support you there, so you, your household, and everyone with you won't starve, since the famine will still last 5 years. You and my brother Benjamin have seen with your own eyes that I'm speaking to you. Tell my father about my power in Egypt and about everything you've seen. Hurry and bring my father down here." He threw his arms around his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his shoulder. He kissed all of his brothers and wept embracing them. After that, his brothers were finally able to talk to him. So this is a story of betrayal and reconciliation. And Joseph certainly deserves a place in history. He's God's grace embodied. Whenever we say that the Old Testament stories don't have a gracious God, don't have a loving God, we don't see the forgiveness that we do in the New Testament, we can point to stories like this one. Can we have a favorite patriarch? Maybe. And let's not forget Reuben. He's important, and also a delicious sandwich. He saved Joseph. So we read these disturbing stories in Genesis. I mean, all the patriarchs and most of the matriarchs have made really grave errors and bad mistakes. They've done some crummy things. I mean, everything from Abraham saying that Sarah was his sister to Jacob stealing the birthright. They've all done their share of crummy deeds. So we have all these stories like pelting darts at us. We're having trouble accepting them and trying to take them in. And then in chapter 45, we have this softball lobbed toward us. This forgiveness of Joseph. He's now top of the heap, in charge of everything. And instead of, just inviting his father and the people who didn't sell him into slavery, he gathers his brothers together and embraces them and gives them what they ask for. Joseph is forgiving and generous to the very people who betrayed him. And Joseph's forgiveness is legendary. Miraculous to our modern ears in the lives we live, but it would have been miraculous to the ears of the listeners of the Hebrew stories way back then. These stories filled with violence and retribution and duplicity and trickery and infidelity and failure to comply. The First Testament is really hard to read sometimes. I mean, later on in Samuel, King David just goes out marauding because it's springtime. It's not even a reason for it. But the gospel, the New Testament, the stories about Jesus, there's so much more light and life and love. The stories about Jesus are about liberation and grace and a lot of forgiveness. Jesus on the cross, being placed there by the very people, says, "Father, forgive them." The Jesus narrative is so much easier pill to swallow than a lot of these Genesis stories alone. Aside from God, it's rare to see characters forgiving people when they fail them. But there are a few other examples in the First Testament. There's Esau, forgiving Jacob. And Jacob continues to be the one inheriting the blessings of God in the story, but Esau's the more forgiving and loving one. There's the prophet Hosea, who has the wife that's a prostitute. He keeps trying to buy her back. It's more of a symbolism of God trying to do right by, or be merciful to God's people. And then there's the story that we have today. Joseph forgiving his brothers. Joseph, in his forgiveness, says something problematic, though. There's still a problem. There's always a problem. Revealing himself to his brothers, he says this, "Now don't be upset and don't be angry with yourselves that you sold me here. Actually, God sent me before you to save lives." Oh, so it's all good. The best way for God to work in your life is for something really tragic, like being sold into slavery, to happen to you. No. Could you tell the sarcasm in the voice there? No. I mean, maybe some preachers will preach that to you about this, It's okay. Slavery is all right. It teaches people lessons and helps them to grow as people. I say no. I think Jesus says no. No, that is not okay. And there's something vitally wrong with that whole concept. That God meant for Joseph to be sold into slavery by his brothers. I think brothers meant to do harm to their brother, and then God showed up and did something good. Rejecting the idea that anybody should be a slave. Now, I can back this up with scripture later on, but I don't want to spoil you for next week when we talk about Moses, okay? There's something vitally wrong with that, and that's why we need to be in conversation with Scripture. We need to go back and read it as the old rabbis did, and that they do still today, to say, this is not quite what we think God is all about. So why would Joseph say this? Why would people interpret this as God's action in the world? Because slavery is never okay. And to suggest that being sold into slavery was to achieve God's higher purposes is just icky, for lack of a better word. And that's why it's better for us to try to engage in a conversation with Scripture and try to learn from it there. Because God can bring impossible circumstances, and He can use those for good. God can bring light out of the darkest places. We see that. And so here they are in the land of Goshen. Joseph said, bring everybody here, right here to Egypt. Right here to Egypt. I'm not a slave anymore. I'm Pharaoh's second hand. And a few hundred years later, they're all slaves. I told you this video was to be continued. Leo.
From Genesis 3 onward, humans keep acting selfishly and doing evil, but this God is not going to leave His world to its own devices. He remains faithful and determined to bless people despite their failures. You can see this especially in how that mysterious promise about the descendant of the woman gets developed throughout the book. So remember, Genesis 3, God promised that this wounded victor would come and crush the snake and defeat evil at its source. And the author then connects this promise directly to the line of Abraham. This is a part of how God's going to bring His blessing to the nations. Now from Abraham, this promise gets connected to Judah, the fourth son of Jacob. And this is how. In an extremely important poem in chapter 49, in aging Jacob, he's on his deathbed, he wants to bless his 12 sons. And when he comes to Judah, Jacob predicts that Judah will become the tribe of Israel's royal leaders, and that one day a king will come who will command the obedience of all the nations and fulfill God's promise to restore the garden blessing to all of the world. And then after this, Jacob dies. And later Joseph dies too. And the growing family remains in Egypt. And so the book of Genesis ends with all of these future hopes and promises left hanging and undeveloped. And it forces you to turn the page to see how it's all going to turn out. But for now, that's the book of Genesis.
To be continued again. Because don't you want to see what happens? The end of Genesis is Exodus, right? The Exodus story. So next week, practice your Go Down Moses song. And that's where it leads us. Be not discouraged. If God can release and forgive through Joseph, then God can release the future generations from slavery. And we're going to talk about our patriarch Moses next week.